but I can actually change them to another type of object by right-clicking on them, which brings up a quad menu. And you can actually go down to the convert menu where you can convert them into an editable mesh, an editable poly, an editable patch, or a NURBS object. If we were to actually pick one of these options, it would use the values which were currently active in the procedural object here and actually bake those values down into the kind of object that we actually picked. So I'll quickly show you that. If I do wireframe view, you can actually see that a little bit more clearly. I'll just make these a different color actually, so they stand up a bit better in the viewport. So if I click on here and say convert to editable mesh, at that point you won't notice any difference, and that's because the end result basically looks exactly the same in the viewport, and that's because all objects effectively end up as an editable mesh to be displayed in the viewport anyway, so you won't actually notice any difference at that point. You will notice though that the parameters here have actually changed. If I undo that and we'll change it to an editable poly, again we see hardly any difference, and that's because an editable poly is actually very similar to an editable mesh. It's a polygon based object and therefore there's no change in the viewport. But if you actually look over here, you'd actually notice if you went back and forth between an editable mesh and editable poly that they actually have slightly different parameters. We'll just undo that. Editable patch. Now at this point you'll actually notice that there is a difference, and that's because it's actually a patch based object. And a NURB. And again, there's a noticeable difference, and that's again because now it's actually converted to something which is actually quite fundamentally different from an editable mesh. So as I said, when you actually click on this right menu and go to convert, it's actually changing the object type to a new type of geometry. And all of this goes on behind the scenes. But that is actually what's actually happening. Your transform node obviously stays the same, but your geotype actually changes to a new type of geometry. Now of course, these scene nodes actually define quite large aspects of our scene's objects, and the definition of these objects is held in smaller informational elements called parameters. So we can actually think of a scene node as being a collection of these parameters, and we have to bear in mind that these parameters can hold a wide variety of different types of information to support their parents node functionality. In some cases, a parameter will be a simple text value, such as the object's name, or it could be a single floating point value, such as this teapot's radius here. Or maybe an integer value, such as a sphere's segmentation, which you can see here, where this teapot actually has a segmentation value as well. Now, a node's parameters in 3ds Max can have one of two states. The simplest is the default, and that is where the node basically stores the value for a parameter within its defined place. This is only useful though when the parameter is staying static over time. If this is the case, keeping the value within the node uses less system resources and keeps the scene simpler, which is always a good thing in any 3D pipeline. But what happens when a value needs to change over time? At this point, a new node is defined called a controller, and this is basically a mini program that is used to define the values for that parameter needs at any point in time based on the animation applied by the user. These controllers are only created in 3ds Max when a parameter is actually animated. As we just discussed, this is to conserve memory usage and also to keep our scene as simple as possible. 3ds Max has a large number of these controllers that can be used to define any value that can be animated over time. They are a key feature of the software and are directly involved in any form of animation and rigging. We'll look at these controllers in much more depth in a future DVD, but let's quickly have a look at actually what they are. If I go to the curve editor by using the quad box, that's a right click, you can see that we have the transform node of the object here. And then we have the object node here. And if we open that up, you'll actually see that we have these parameters. These are actually represented here. We've got the radius, the segmentation, and then we've got the body parts and so on. Now, if I change the radius here, you'll see nothing is actually changing in the view here. That's because I'm not actually animating that value. And if you actually look at each one of these little branches to this data tree, you'll see that the actual icon next to it is grayed out. What that actually means is that there's actually no controller assigned at that point. So if I go to the radius value and I'll just move to frame 10 and I'll turn on animation. I'm going to actually animate that value now, and if you look at the radius value, you'll actually notice that it does actually acquire a controller when I animate the value. So I'll just go up here and change the radius to say 39, say 40. And now you'll notice that the actual icon here is not grayed out anymore. That shows that a controller has actually been assigned to that particular parameter. If we do the same for the segmentation, again, you'll notice a controller is actually assigned at this point. If we right click on here, you can see we can actually assign controllers manually, and it comes up with a big list here of all the possible controllers for that parameter type. So if we wanted to, we could go down to smooth, right click on it, assign a controller, and there you can actually assign a controller if you actually wanted to for that parameter. So you can see you can actually do it manually, or you can do it implicitly by actually animating. And when you animate any parameter, at that point a controller will be added. So what do we actually know at this point? Well, we know that our scenes are built up of scene nodes, and that these are plugged together via a defined procedure, and that these nodes are made up of parameters. That these parameters define the various elements of that node, and we also know that these parameters can have further nodes plugged into them called controllers that define their animated values when and where they are needed. So let's move on now and have a look at how these elements have been handled in 3ds Max and also other 3D software to give us a broader perspective on this topic.